They say hell has no fury like a woman scorned, but they are completely wrong. The most dangerous creature alive is a mother operating on 0 hours of sleep, armed with a data analyst's mind. When my husband smirked in that Denver courtroom, holding his pregnant mistress while calling our 3-week-old son a bastard, he thought I was broken. He had no idea the red folder resting on my table was the final nail in his coffin. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Zoe Revenge Stories. We recently faced a heartbreaking setback as YouTube has demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to keep operating and paying our hardworking team. If you find today's story captivating, please consider supporting us with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or clicking the link in the description or pinned comment, so we can pay for living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. My name is Jade Hudson, and my story begins in the freezing corridors of a family court in Denver, Colorado. The air conditioning in the building was set so aggressively low it felt like walking directly into an industrial meat locker. It was a stark, brutal contrast to the radiating warmth of my 3-week-old son, who was strapped securely to my chest in his fabric baby carrier, sleeping completely undisturbed by the tension in the room. I tightened my woolen coat around him, feeling his steady, tiny heartbeat against my ribs. That little rhythm was the only thing keeping me grounded. The heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open violently, and in walked Ethan, my soon-to-be ex-husband. He carried himself not like a man facing the solemn dissolution of his family, but with the arrogant, untouchable swagger of a Silicon Valley tech executive stepping onto a stage for a highly anticipated product launch. Clinging tightly to his arm was Chloe, his 22-year-old mistress. Her own pregnant belly was proudly on display beneath a tight, shockingly expensive designer dress. They walked down the center aisle looking less like respondents in a legal battle and more like a celebrity couple arriving at an exclusive gala. Ethan's cold eyes scanned the room and immediately locked onto me. He did not look at his newborn son with a shred of love, guilt, or even basic human curiosity. Instead, he stopped right in the middle of the aisle, intentionally ensuring everyone in the gallery, the bailiff, and the court clerks could hear his projecting voice. "I cannot believe you had the nerve to bring that bastard into this courtroom, Jade," he sneered, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. He wanted to break me right there on the spot. He wanted a visceral reaction. He was waiting for a tear, a scream, a public meltdown to desperately prove his fabricated narrative that I was an unstable, hysterical woman, but I gave him absolutely nothing. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice in defense. I simply raised my hands and gently covered my son's tiny ears, shielding his innocence from the toxic venom spilling from his father's mouth. My absolute, stone-cold silence seemed to unnerve Ethan more than any screaming match ever could. I maintained a chilling, deadpan composure as I took my seat beside my attorney. Soon after, the judge took the bench, and Ethan's high-priced attorney launched into a wildly aggressive opening monologue. The lawyer paced the floor like a predator, confidently tossing out outrageous, insulting demands. He argued that there were severe, documented doubts regarding the biological paternity of the child, demanding an absolute refusal of any child support obligations. Furthermore, he aggressively pushed to activate the infidelity clause within our prenuptial agreement, falsely claiming that I was the one who had strayed, all in a calculated attempt to leave me with 0% of our marital assets. As the lawyer continued to drone on, loudly painting a picture of my supposed betrayals, I quietly reached into my heavy leather tote bag. I pulled out a thick, bright red folder. I moved deliberately, placing it down onto the solid wooden table in front of my own lawyer. It landed with a heavy, hollow thud that echoed sharply enough to briefly cut through the opposing counsel's arrogant speech. The judge's eyes darted toward the sudden sound, narrowing with sharp curiosity at the glaring red square resting ominously on our desk. But my lawyer did not open it. We just let it sit there, staring straight ahead at the man I once loved. I let Ethan believe he was winning this game. I let him believe his carefully constructed web of lies and deceit was holding up perfectly. He had absolutely no idea the catastrophic magnitude of the storm brewing inside that folder. To understand how a supposed tech genius ended up standing completely blind on top of a landmine of his own creation, and how I found myself sitting in this freezing room with a heart made of pine ice, we have to go back to the very beginning. Orasync. Innovations did not start in a towering glass skyscraper. It began in the suffocating heat of our cramped garage. I was the ghost in the machine, writing every single line of our revolutionary virtual reality core code, hiding my identity behind glowing monitors. Ethan was the face. He wore the tailored suits, schmoozed the venture capitalists, and sold the vision. We were the perfect symbiotic organism. I built the unstoppable engine, and he drove the car. For years, we survived on cheap coffee and shared a singular, consuming dream. But success is a highly volatile chemical. It does not fundamentally change a person. It simply dissolves the carefully constructed mask they have been wearing all along. The fracture began when Orasync started preparing for our initial public offering. Wall Street analysts were projecting a valuation in the hundreds of millions of dollars. As the numbers grew astronomical, the man I married began to evaporate into thin air. He became chronically irritable, aggressively secretive, and entirely detached from our life. He blamed the grueling corporate schedule, claiming he needed to take endless, exhausting business trips to the West Coast to secure anchor investors. I spent my days heavily pregnant and completely isolated in our sprawling house, managing the server architecture remotely while he was supposedly having late-night dinner meetings in Silicon Valley. I desperately wanted to believe his excuses, but I am a data analyst, and data never lies. The devastating truth did not arrive through a sloppy, late-night text message or a smell of unfamiliar perfume on his collar. It happened during the 8th month of my pregnancy. I was conducting a routine, deep-level audit of our corporate tax filings for the final quarter. That was when my eyes caught an anomaly. It was a misfiled expense report, buried deep within a subsidiary folder. It was not a high-end dinner receipt or a luxury hotel bill. It was a scanned invoice for a $45,000 custom diamond ring, fraudulently categorized under miscellaneous hardware upgrades. Attached to the invoice was a delivery manifest addressed to a woman named Chloe. My heart stopped beating, but my analytical brain immediately went into absolute overdrive. A normal wife would have called her husband screaming, throwing plates against the wall, demanding answers through hysterical sobs. But I am a systems architect. When I detect a malicious breach, I do not alert the hacker. I lock the doors and monitor their every move. Relying on the pure survival instinct of a mother, I used my foundational administrative privileges to quietly install a suite of highly advanced, entirely legal tracking software across our entire internal network. Because I built the system from the ground up, my back door was completely invisible to Ethan and his entire IT department. Within 48 hours, the horrifying, sprawling scope of his betrayal materialized on my monitors. This was not a simple affair. Chloe was not just a young mistress he met at a hotel bar. She was a junior acquisitions associate at a massive rival tech conglomerate. They were not just sleeping together. They were actively orchestrating a devastating corporate heist. I watched in real time, reading encrypted emails, as Ethan drafted illicit contracts to secretly transfer the core copyrights of my software into a hidden shell company. He was fully intending to sell my life's work to our biggest competitor and pocket the untraceable cash. The absolute crushing blow, however, was not the financial treason. It was a single audio file. Ethan had used his company phone to call Chloe, and my security protocol recorded every single spoken syllable. I sat alone in my dark home office, my hands resting protectively on my swollen belly, and listened to my husband's voice plotting my destruction. "Do not worry about the shares," Ethan said to her, his tone dripping with a cold, sociopathic calculation. "Right before the public offering, I am going to serve her papers. I will tell the board and the judge that the baby she is carrying is not mine. The infidelity clause in our prenuptial agreement will strip her of everything, She will be out on the street with $0, and we will take the entire company." The recording ended, leaving a deafening, heavy silence in the room. I sat in the pitch black for hours, letting the darkness swallow me whole. I did not shed a single tear. Crying requires a broken heart, and my heart was no longer broken. It was frozen solid. The man I loved was dead, replaced by a greedy parasite actively trying to destroy my unborn child and steal my legacy. Sitting there in the suffocating silence, I felt my baby kick strongly against my palm. A terrifying, absolute calm washed over my entire body. I realized then that I was not going to simply survive this betrayal. I was going to meticulously weave a trap, and I was going to burn his entire world to ashes. To survive the remaining weeks of my pregnancy, I had to become the greatest actress on the planet. I split my existence into two completely separate realities. By day, I was the tragic, fragile wife drowning in severe prenatal depression. I wore oversized sweatpants, left my hair unwashed, and spent hours staring blankly out the living room window. Whenever Ethan actually bothered to come home, I made sure he found me weeping softly on the sofa, complaining about my hormones and how exhausted I felt. My calculated vulnerability stroked his massive ego. He looked at me not with concern, but with thinly veiled contempt, utterly convinced that I was too weak and distracted to notice the ground collapsing beneath my feet. He thought he was outsmarting a hysterical housewife. He forgot he was dealing with the primary architect of his entire empire. But the moment Ethan's sports car left the driveway for his fake business dinners, my tears dried instantly. The weeping victim vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating machine. I retreated to my secure server room in the basement, locking the reinforced door behind me. Under the cover of darkness, I utilized my supreme root access, a god-level administrative backdoor I had hard-coded into the company's mainframe on day one, which Ethan and his amateur security team never even knew existed. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, silently extracting every single piece of his digital soul. I bypassed their encrypted firewalls in minutes, mirroring his private server drives directly onto my hidden offshore cloud accounts. I downloaded thousands of illegal transaction logs, offshore wire transfers, and the meticulously detailed blueprints of his massive money laundering operation. I tracked every single penny he was siphoning to Chloe's dummy corporations. It was during one of these grueling, sleep-deprived deep dives that I stumbled upon the smoking gun that elevated his betrayal from a simple corporate divorce into a severe federal felony. Hidden inside a restricted legal directory, I found the finalized shareholder proxy documents required for our upcoming initial public offering. These documents officially surrendered my voting rights and transferred my majority stake directly into his personal holding company. I zoomed in on the signature line. There was my name, flawlessly signed. But I had never seen that document in my life. Running a rapid pixel density analysis, I confirmed what my gut already knew. He had digitally cloned my signature from an old tax return and forged it onto the proxy forms. Ethan was not just a cheating husband anymore. He had committed massive securities fraud. If those forged documents reached Wall Street, the entire initial public offering would instantly implode, dragging him straight to a federal penitentiary. My water broke at 2 o'clock in the morning on a freezing Tuesday. I drove myself to the hospital, gripping the steering wheel through agonizing contractions, completely alone. After 14 exhausting hours of labor, my beautiful, perfect son took his first breath. He was tiny, helpless, and the only pure thing left in my ruined world. Ethan finally arrived at the maternity ward a full 5 hours later. He did not bring flowers. He did not bring a teddy bear. He walked into my recovery room wearing a tailored Italian suit, checking his designer watch as if he were annoyed at being double booked. He stood at the foot of my bed, completely ignoring the fragile newborn sleeping in the plastic bassinet beside me. His visit lasted exactly 10 minutes. "I am filing for divorce," Ethan announced, his voice devoid of any human emotion. He reached inside his breast pocket and carelessly tossed a folded piece of paper onto my lap. It landed right on top of my hospital gown. My lawyers will be in touch. And do not even think about asking for a single dime of my company. I want a mandatory paternity test performed immediately. I know you have been sleeping around. Jade. The attending nurse, who was checking my intravenous drip, literally gasped out loud, staring at Ethan in sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked at me, expecting me to burst into violent sobs. I looked down at the demand for a genetic test, then slowly looked back up at the man I once thought I would spend my life with. I offered him nothing but a blank, chilling stare. "Get out," I whispered softly. He scoffed, turned on his heel, and walked out of the room, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and shattered illusions. The second the heavy hospital door clicked shut behind him, the facade dropped. I did not waste a single precious second crying. I turned to the horrified nurse and politely asked her to hand me my heavy laptop bag from the visitor chair, ignoring the throbbing pain in my body and the needle taped to my arm. I booted up my encrypted workstation right there in the maternity bed. I accessed the company's central nervous system. It was time to pull the plug. With a few lethal keystrokes, I executed a catastrophic security reroute. I systematically revoked Ethan's executive credentials, severed his network pathways, and completely locked him out of the proprietary virtual reality source code. To him and his engineering team, their screens would suddenly go black, displaying a generic, unskippable error message that simply read, "System updating. Please contact your network administrator." They were effectively paralyzed, locked out of the very product they were trying to steal. But I was not done. While my newborn son slept peacefully beside me, I opened a highly secure, encrypted browser window. I navigated to the official portal of the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, acting as a protected corporate whistleblower. I formally submitted a massive, undeniable cache of evidence detailing Ethan's fraudulent initial public offering filings, the shell companies, and the forged proxy signatures. I was no longer just preparing for a messy divorce. I was weaving a colossal, inescapable net that would bring down the wrath of the federal government upon his head. Over the next few weeks, operating on zero sleep and fueled by pure adrenaline, I meticulously organized my armory. I secretly conducted the DNA test Ethan demanded, ensuring the results were processed by the most reputable, unimpeachable medical facility in the state. I printed the genetic results, the forensic proof of the forged signatures, the wire transfer receipts to Chloe, and the official whistleblower confirmation from the federal investigators. Every single devastating document, every piece of lethal evidence, was carefully stacked, hole-punched, and bound together. I placed them all inside a singular, thick, bright red folder. It was not just a collection of papers anymore. It was a loaded weapon, waiting patiently in the dark for the perfect moment to be fired. The art of war is entirely based on deception. If your enemy is arrogant, you must encourage his arrogance until it becomes his absolute undoing. I knew Ethan's high-priced legal mercenaries would thoroughly investigate anyone I hired to represent me. So, I deliberately sought out the most unassuming, seemingly incompetent lawyer in the entire state of Colorado. I hired a 73-year-old family attorney named Arthur. Arthur operated out of a dusty, dimly lit strip mall office. He had spent the last 40 years handling petty alimony disputes and arguing over who gets the living room sofa. He wore terribly wrinkled corduroy suits, constantly misplaced his wire-rimmed reading glasses, and possessed exactly zero experience in complex corporate litigation. When Ethan's impeccably tailored legal team saw poor old Arthur bumbling through his yellow legal pads at our very first meeting, I could practically see them actively salivating. They looked at him the way a pack of starving wolves looks at a wounded sheep. During the exhausting pre-trial mediations, I fully committed to playing my role. I attended every single session looking completely hollowed out. I carried my newborn son in my arms, allowing him to fuss just enough to make me look utterly overwhelmed and distracted. I kept my eyes securely glued to the floor, my voice barely rising above a trembling whisper. When Ethan confidently demanded full ownership of our primary residence, a sprawling $6 million mansion in the exclusive Cherry Creek neighborhood. I simply nodded. When his lawyers aggressively pushed to take the entire collection of vintage European sports cars we had acquired, I softly agreed without raising a single objection. "She is breaking," I heard Ethan whisper to his lead counsel during a brief recess. I handed over the superficial wealth without a fight. Ethan strutted out of those conference rooms, puffing out his chest, completely convinced I was a deeply traumatized woman desperate to just walk away with whatever shattered pieces of my sanity I had left. He truly believed I was surrendering. In reality, I was just clearing the battlefield of completely useless, distracting debris so I could have a clean shot at his throat. While I was busy playing the defeated, exhausted housewife, Ethan and Chloe were enthusiastically celebrating their premature victory. They hosted incredibly lavish, catered parties in the very mansion he had just legally wrestled away from me. They spared absolutely no expense, dropping $50,000 on imported champagne and floral arrangements for a single evening. Worse than the spending, they actively poisoned the well of Denver's high society. They planted vicious, calculated rumors into the eager ears of every influential investor and socialite they could find. Chloe took immense pleasure in telling the wealthy country club wives that I was deeply mentally unstable, wildly promiscuous, and actively trying to extort her brilliant fiancé using an illegitimate child. They spun a tragic, highly believable fairy tale where Ethan was the noble, suffering victim bravely escaping a psychotic, cheating wife. But while they were busy drinking $1,000 champagne and destroying my social reputation, I was quietly tightening the invisible noose around their necks. Ethan was relying incredibly heavily on the massive, 8-figure payout from the rival tech conglomerate to fund his luxurious new life and cover the mounting hidden debts he had accrued, setting up his shell companies. So, acting from a secure, encrypted public terminal, I drafted an untraceable email. I sent it directly to the senior board of directors of that exact rival company. I did not send them the whole truth. That would have been too easy. I just gave them a tiny, terrifying glimpse of the disaster they were about to buy. I attached a single, heavily redacted legal document proving that the core intellectual property rights of AuraSync Innovations were currently locked in a highly volatile active legal dispute regarding ownership. Corporate boards governing multi-billion-dollar enterprises are inherently cowardly entities. The second they smelled the faintest whiff of legal jeopardy, they slammed the brakes on the entire secret acquisition. The backdoor deal was suddenly frozen indefinitely pending a massive internal risk assessment. Ethan's hidden cash flow dried up entirely overnight. Panic is a truly beautiful thing to witness in an endlessly arrogant man. With his offshore funds temporarily locked and the corporate acquisition stalled, Ethan was rapidly bleeding money trying to keep his fake, lavish lifestyle afloat. He desperately needed to finalize our divorce immediately to officially free up his unencumbered shares and forcefully push the sale through. His mounting financial desperation completely blinded him to his own surroundings. In his frantic rush to finish me off and get his money, he began making catastrophic, unforced errors. He ordered his accounting team to aggressively expedite the final asset division paperwork, to actively hide the millions he had already stolen. He formally submitted a stack of heavily doctored financial statements to the family court judge. What he did not realize in his blind panic was that I had meticulously planted those specific, falsified ledgers in his personal server over a month earlier. I had specifically designed them to look exactly like his own sloppy handiwork. He had unknowingly taken my poisoned bait, signed his name on the dotted line under the strict penalty of perjury, and handed it directly to the court. The clock relentlessly counted down to the final hearing. Every single piece on the board was locked firmly into position. Ethan was confidently marching forward, entirely unaware that he was standing squarely in the middle of a massive minefield he had dug with his very own hands. The echoing silence of the freezing Denver courtroom snapped me violently back to the present. Ethan's highly paid attack dog of a lawyer had finally reached the crescendo of his grueling, hour-long character assassination. He stood aggressively close to the judge's bench, dramatically waving a hand toward my side of the room. "Your Honor!" the lawyer bellowed, his voice dripping with theatrical outrage. Given the undeniable evidence of my client's extreme emotional distress, combined with the respondent's clear violation of the moral conduct clauses stipulated within their prenuptial agreement, we formally request that Jade Hudson be stripped of any and all equity stakes in AuraSync Innovations. She has forfeited her right to benefit from a company built entirely by her husband's tireless labor. Behind the wooden partition separating the gallery, I could hear a distinct, obnoxious giggle. It was Chloe. She was leaning heavily over the wooden railing, her chin resting dangerously close to Ethan's shoulder. I watched from the corner of my eye as she whispered something directly into his ear. Though the words were muffled, I could easily read her glossy lips. She was already congratulating him, telling him they were only minutes away from becoming billionaires. Ethan simply tilted his head, giving her a slow, sickeningly arrogant wink. He was entirely convinced he had already won the war. The judge, a stern woman with decades of experience dealing with bitter divorces, let out a long, heavy sigh. She adjusted her thick reading glasses and directed her piercing gaze across the room to where my elderly attorney and I sat in total silence. My baby continued to sleep peacefully against my chest, completely unaware of the venom filling the room. "Mr. Sterling," the judge addressed my lawyer, her tone carrying a hint of genuine pity, "the petitioner has levied some exceptionally severe allegations regarding marital fidelity and the rightful ownership of these corporate assets. Do you and your client have any formal defense to present before I make my ruling?" For a brief, agonizing moment, the entire courtroom held its breath. Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, crossing his arms with absolute certainty, fully expecting Arthur to stutter through a pathetic plea for leniency or a minor alimony concession. Instead, Arthur stood up. The transformation was instantaneous and utterly terrifying. The bumbling, absent-minded grandfather who had spent the last 3 months seemingly misplacing his files and forgetting names vanished into thin air. His slouched shoulders suddenly squared with rigid military precision. He buttoned his supposedly wrinkled suit jacket with a sharp, fluid motion. When he looked up at the judge, his eyes were no longer clouded with confusion. They were burning with the cold, lethal clarity of an apex predator locking onto its prey. "Your Honor," Arthur began, his voice suddenly booming across the room with a commanding baritone resonance that made Ethan physically jolt in his seat. "We do not simply have a defense. We have a motion to radically expand the jurisdictional scope of these proceedings." The judge raised a skeptical eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the sudden shift in demeanor. "Expand the scope. Counselor, this is a family court. We are here to dissolve a marriage and divide household assets." "With all due respect, Your Honor." Arthur fired back smoothly, pacing confidently toward the center aisle. "What sits before you today is not a simple dissolution of marriage. It is the final stage of a massive, heavily orchestrated corporate heist. Before entering private practice, I spent 25 years serving as a senior prosecutor for the United States Department of Justice, specializing in aggressive financial fraud and federal racketeering. And I can say with absolute certainty that the assets currently under discussion were acquired through severe criminal enterprise." A loud wave of murmurs instantly erupted from the gallery. The court reporter's fingers flew frantically across her machine. Ethan's arrogant smirk completely collapsed, instantly replaced by a deep, defensive frown. He frantically leaned over to his lead counsel, demanding to know what was happening. But his expensive lawyer looked just as paralyzed as he did. The air in the room grew completely stagnant. Then, the heavy oak doors at the very back of the courtroom swung open with a slow, deliberate creak. Every head turned. 2 towering men dressed in immaculate, identically tailored dark suits walked inside. They did not announce themselves. They simply flashed golden badges clipped to their belts to the armed bailiff, walked silently down the aisle, and took a seat in the very back row, their eyes locked dead on Ethan. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally began to bleed into Ethan's eyes. He swallowed hard, his breathing suddenly shallow. He stared at the 2 federal agents, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. Arthur slowly turned around, walking back to our desk. He placed his hand flat on the solid wood, right next to the glaring object that had been sitting ignored since the hearing began. "Your Honor," Arthur declared, his voice slicing through the tense murmurs like a surgical scalpel. He pointed a single, steady finger directly at the bright red folder. "Everything you need to see, every lie told in this room today, and every single federal crime committed by the petitioner is contained right here. I formally request to submit this into evidence, as it will fundamentally alter the entire reality of this case." The judge leaned forward, her eyes locked on our table. "Open the folder, Counselor," she instructed, her voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating tension of the courtroom. Arthur nodded slowly. He unclasped the bright red cover, letting it fall open to reveal the meticulously organized stacks of paper inside. He reached in and pulled out the very first document, holding it up high so the harsh fluorescent lights caught the embossed seal on the heavy paper. "Exhibit A, Your Honor," Arthur announced smoothly, handing the paperwork to the bailiff to pass up to the bench. "This is the result of a court-ordered, legally binding genetic analysis conducted by the most prestigious, unimpeachable medical research facility in the state of Colorado. It bears their official, embedded watermark. This document confirms, with an absolutely undeniable 100% certainty, that the infant my client is holding is the biological son of the petitioner. The loud theatrical claim made just moments ago calling this child a bastard is not just entirely false. It constitutes malicious, deliberate defamation recorded permanently on the public court transcript." I watched the lead opposing attorney physically recoil. He closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose as he realized his client had lied directly to his face. Ethan stiffened, his arrogant posture instantly crumbling as the label he tried to brand my son with was violently shoved back down his own throat. But Arthur was not even close to being finished. He reached back into the folder and withdrew a much thicker stack of documents bound by heavy brass clips. "Exhibit B," Arthur continued, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "The petitioner has spent this entire hearing demanding that my client be stripped of her equity in AuraSync Innovations, loudly claiming he is the sole genius behind the enterprise. However, these are the original United States patent and copyright registrations for the foundational virtual reality architecture of the software. If you look closely at the filing dates, Your Honor, you will see they were submitted, reviewed, and fully approved 24 months before this couple even met." Ethan gasped. It was a sharp, involuntary sound of pure terror. "My client," Arthur stated proudly, "retains absolute, individual ownership of the intellectual property. The petitioner was never a co-founder. Under the strict eyes of the law, he is merely a contracted employee whom my client generously allowed to hold a temporary executive title to manage day-to-day operations. He owns absolutely nothing. He is, essentially, a highly paid administrative assistant." The entire gallery gasped in unison. The wealthy tech chief executive officer, the man who had paraded around high society claiming to be a visionary genius, was publicly exposed as nothing more than a glorified middleman. Then came the final, fatal blow. Arthur pulled out the last set of documents. They were stamped with bold, black government seals. And finally, Exhibit C. This is a certified copy of an active, highly classified investigation dossier from the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, accompanied by an emergency federal subpoena. This file meticulously outlines a sprawling, multi-million-dollar conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, wire fraud, and extreme financial laundering. Arthur turned slightly, locking his cold, predatory gaze directly onto Ethan. It details exactly how the petitioner, actively conspiring with his mistress, seated right there in the gallery, attempted to illegally siphon massive amounts of capital into hidden offshore shell accounts while knowingly defrauding Wall Street investors and his own board of directors. The blood drained completely from Ethan's face. His skin turned a sickly, pale shade of gray. His jaw dropped open, his lips trembling uncontrollably, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The terrifying reality crashed down on him with the weight of a falling building. He was not just losing his fake company and his stolen wealth, he was staring directly down the barrel of a federal prison sentence that could easily last 30 years. Suddenly, a chaotic shriek shattered the stunned silence. Chloe leaped up from her seat in the gallery, knocking her heavy wooden chair backward onto the floor. Her carefully crafted image of superiority evaporated into pure, desperate panic. "I had nothing to do with it," she screamed at the top of her lungs, pointing a manic, trembling finger at Ethan. "He lied to me. He told me the money was clean. He forced me to sign those transfer documents. I am a victim here. Do not look at me." She threw him to the wolves without a single second of hesitation to save her own skin. It was a pathetic, disgusting display. The two of them, who just 1 hour ago believed they were untouchable royalty, were now squealing and turning on each other like trapped rats. The judge slammed her heavy wooden gavel down so hard the sound cracked like a gunshot. "Order in my court!" she roared, her face twisted in absolute disgust. "I have heard more than enough. The petitioner's requests are denied in their entirety. Full and total control of all marital assets, properties, and corporate holdings are immediately awarded to the respondent." She paused, shooting a cold glare at Ethan. "And seeing as we have federal guests in the room, I believe my part here is done." As she spoke, the two federal agents in the dark suits stepped purposefully down the center aisle, pulling heavy metal handcuffs from their belts. I did not stay to watch them read him his rights. I stood up from the table, taking a deep, cleansing breath of the cool air. I wrapped my arms securely around my beautiful, sleeping baby boy, pressing a gentle kiss to his warm forehead, leaving the bumbling lawyer and the ruined man screaming behind me. I turned and walked proudly out of the freezing courtroom. I stepped through the heavy glass doors and out into the glorious, bright Denver afternoon. The sun was shining brilliantly, casting a warm golden glow on the path forward. I had burned the past to ashes, and from those ashes, a victorious mother and her son were finally free. Thank you so much to everyone for listening to this story today. Where in the world are you tuning in from right now? I would love to know. If you found today's story engaging and satisfying, please consider helping our channel with just $1 by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the description or the pinned comment. Your support allows us to pay our dedicated team members so they can feed their families and continue creating these wonderful stories for you to enjoy. Thank you again, and stay strong.